has caused confusion and delay.
You have caused
Confusion and delay.
that is the pure face prejudice.
Daisy is just the ultimate fart. Daisy is just the ultimate fart.
Your impatience has caused confusion and delay. This storm has caused confusion and delay. You are causing confusion and delay. You cause confusion and delay.
26 years old and you can't even drive? I can. Are you stupid, eh? Are you a stupid fool? Well, why can't you drive then? You can't even drive! Bit grey today.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to another Deepest Law. I'm here with Mr. D. How you doing, D?
I'm doing well. Hope you're well as well.
Yes, and also we are joined by Alexander Adams. Welcome back to the show, Alexander.
Thank you very much, AA. The real AA is in the house. Diversity is our strength, comrades.
And just before we get going, I'll obviously always remind people, do buy my courses at the Academic Agency, Trivium being the best seller there, but other courses are available, including Foundations of Economics, which I encourage people to... I see a sharp decline in economic literacy as time has gone on, but anything you would like to promote, Alexander Adams?
Yes, so people can follow me at Adams Artist on Twitter. If you want to support my work, there's a possibility that you can buy some prints via the exhibition website, the exhibition which ran last week, including Ferro and Fendervilliers and myself. So you can go to that website and there is a place there where you can buy prints from me, signed prints. You can also support my work by visiting alexanderadamsart.substack.com. Becoming a paid member helps me out and gives you access to exclusive content.
And D, anything you'd like to promote before we get going?
No, if people would like, they can follow me for random musings on Twitter at John D with an I instead of J. Or you can catch me on Unpopular Opinions, where I am for some reason the co-host on AA's own channel on Tuesdays.
Oh, I've just remembered this as well. I got the release date for Prophets of Doom earlier on, which means that you can now buy it in the shops. I shared a link on my community notes and on Twitter earlier on, and they're flying off like the Argos catalogue. well, not really, because they're not actually out yet, but people are putting their pre-orders in now, and I'm sending off review copies and things because the publishers have asked. So yeah, if you have an outlet that wants to review Prophets of Doom, let me know and give me an address or whatever, and I can send that back to the publisher. Okay, so without further ado, we are gathered to talk about the art and life of Francis Bacon. Now, there's a lot of material to get through. We've got about 3 hours here, and if we don't get through it all, we will reconvene in 2 weeks' time, as we've talked about. But before we get going, I think the ultimate question that everybody will want to know is, why should anybody care about Francis Bacon? Before we get to know his art and his life, why is it of interest to us and to the audience and so on and so forth?
Okay, sorry.
Alex, go on.
Yeah, so I'll sort of step in and Mr. D will correct me when I get things wrong. So basically, Francis Bacon, 2009 to 1992, the Irish-born British painter, not the late Renaissance scholar and essayist, is of interest to people, I think primarily, well, one for his work, and I think second for his example, because he's, I think once you've come to the end of this stream or these collective streams, that you will, even if you are of a rightward persuasion, you may be surprised at how much you find in common with him, how much his art, while being unconventional and in some ways quite disturbing, in some ways very disturbing, you'll find that he's producing sort of work that has a perennialist and vitalist aspect, which may startle you and may present an alternative to, let's say, a more traditional outlook on art. And he's also a high risk. He's a risk taker. You could describe him as part of a vanguard. He's a gambler. He's in touch with the rawer aspects of life. We'll touch on his political attitudes as well. But I think that a lot of this is just inherent in his art. And I'm sure that by the end of this stream, you will come to understand why he is important to people who are not progressive, who are not left-wing.
And I would, I think those are all very good points. And I would add that, this is part of my mission in these spaces to try to get people out of, to get them to sort of re-examine their assumptions about painting and visual arts in general, and to understand that all of the sort of ideas, all the sorts of philosophies of life and ways of looking at the world that we talk about when we talk about philosophy, we talk about literature, we talk about politics. All of those can be expressed in ways that aren't just a sort of narrow band of kind of academic art, which I think people, especially in sort of more right-leaning political spaces, tend to sort of lean on. And I tried to do this with Warhol. I think it may be slightly easier with Bacon, because I think at heart Bacon is a very serious painter. He was really one of the great figurative painters of the 20th century. And then, as you will hear from both from him and from us, that he always thought of himself as an absolute realist artist. He was concerned with the depiction of what he saw as the real, and especially the real as it relates to the human body. So, again, people interested in figurative artists of the past, the sort of great artists, Michelangelo and Rubens and Ingres and many others, can also perhaps start to see someone like Bacon, even though his paintings, may look unconventional, as part of that, a great part of that tradition. So, yeah.
I mean, just before we got going, I guess my comment would be that I've always been a bit. I'm not keen on treating art as left or right. I tend to think that a really great art or a really great artist, in a way, is just talking about I don't want to sound like trite, but like the human condition, things like the relationship between the individual and society. I mean, these sorts of things, that they can tell us something about the world that we're living in and something about human nature or whatever, without necessarily all those terms being reduced down to left or right. This was one of my, when I was writing books on Shakespeare, this is one of the things I was trying to get beyond, really, was the insatiable desire to try to treat, for example, Shakespeare's plays as sites of kind of contemporary left versus right debates and things like that. Because it in a way, I think those works have something like all of life in them, i.e. they're somehow like beyond just kind of small p politics. And I would like to think that all great art can aspire to that sort of level.
Very, very good. A very good point. Yeah. I think it does point to the sort of smallness of contemporary discourse, and certainly I think it's also the kind of partially the fault of the sort of academic trend towards kind of Marxist materialist analysis that reduces everything to this sort of level of kind of that sort of low politics. So I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, and also I would say, like, if you want to consider yourself educated regarding the visual arts, then Francis Bacon is a really important painter to know. And so if you consider yourself knowledgeable and you want to put forward a case, you really need to know about this sort of art, even if it may not be your particular choice. That if you're going to argue or discuss intelligently, you need to know about Francis Bacon.
Yes, absolutely. And again, art goes beyond whether you like it or not. You know, that's almost kind of superfluous if you, as AA says, if you want to have a serious sort of discussion about these sort of timeless questions of being in the world. And also Bacon is a fascinating British character of a type which, of course, is gone from the world. You know, but he was very much part of several sort of very important moments in the 20th century that I think also make him interesting as a kind of cultural figure.
All right, great. So why don't we make a start then? I will now hide our little avatar, so we hide behind the image. There we are. We're gone. What are we looking at here?
Well, I think Mr. D is going to sort of lead off with a lot of these slides. But what I will say is, first of all, just that we've both D and I are big fans of Francis Bacon. You know, sort of unashamedly so. We've spent a lot of time looking at his work, visiting his exhibitions, seeing his work in museums. We've also read lots of catalogues on his art. I happen to have the catalogue raisonné to my side. Now, the catalogue raisonné, I should explain that catalogue raisonné is basically, it's a scientific attempt to catalogue everything that an artist has done. Sometimes these are done by drawings or paintings or sculpture or so forth. Or sometimes if an artist has a small amount of work, everything goes into 1 or 2 volumes. This is a 5-volume set. And I've got the chronology here, so I should be able to look up the most accurate data we have on Francis Bacon. And as Dee was saying before we started, his origins are both known and interestingly mythologized, I think.
Yes, and also very much by himself. You know, as with any artist and with any sort of, I think, great figure, you have to understand his own narratives as part of, and not necessarily take them for kind of, you know, their forthrightness. You know, when you sort of read Bacon, especially sort of read his interviews or watch his interviews, as many of them have been filmed and recorded, you will hear certain stories and certain tales come up again and again. So, and of course, you know, he was born. I mean, you know, as you can see from this photograph, which is him and his mother, Winifred, Christine Winifred Firth was her maiden name. Born in 1909. I mean, he was sort of like, again, came from a different age. You know, I mean, these were Edwardians. His family were fairly well to do. He was born in Ireland, in Dublin, but he was to British parents. I believe his father's was had been from Australia. But you know, there's not a terribly detailed account of his early years, and in fact, he doesn't really follow a trajectory that we associate with many artists, especially artists today. He didn't go to art school or college. He had no formal sort of rigorous training of any sort. He was sort of barely went to school at all. I mean, he had a tutor at one point. He briefly attended boys' school in Cheltenham, but other than that, he was, you know, again, not really brought up, and certainly not brought up in an artistic environment at all. I mean, his parents bred racehorses. His father bred racehorses, especially. So again, it's very sort of difficult to tease out things like that. I mean, I tend not to put a huge amount of emphasis on this kind of, you know, early life. I tend to give artists a sense of respect, in that I am very interested in when they sort of come to a maturity that they, you know, that shows, you know, them taking command of their own work. I don't like this sort of dabble in psychoanalysis, you know, this sort of you know, Leonardo and a dream of his childhood, Sigmund Freud sort of thing. So I tend to kind of gloss over these things. And again, it's easier with Bacon because, you know, there's not a lot of material. And he really didn't start, at least according to him, his first serious work was in 1944. He was born in 1909. So there was a great gestation period.
And also, but this is a convenient rewriting of his history. So a lot of the mystery regarding Bacon's origins was deliberate on his part. That he was extremely controlling about what was known about him. So I mean, there was for many decades after he'd become a national figure, there were still people who couldn't pin down his birth date. People were saying, "Oh, it's 1908, it's 1910." It's 1909. But for several, in lots of serious catalogues from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you'll get different dates because he was deliberately vague about a lot of things, and this was, I think, it's to protect. It was to give him more control. So the more doubt there is, the less hard facts there are, the more you can embroider, the more you can leave things out. And we will find that pretty much everything before 1944 gets discounted or concealed. And this was deliberate because Bacon decided, basically, he was reborn as an artist, as a serious artist, after having, you know, one or two full starts in his career before that point. And so the 1944 point is really important because everything before then is dismissed. In fact, what happened was, in later years, when he became successful, he simply would not acknowledge or exhibit anything that he did before 1944, even though we know he did make artworks. We've got some evidence of those, but he just simply wouldn't have these reproduced or exhibited. And sometimes when these works of art came up, he destroyed them. So he destroyed a lot of work. So anyway, this is all part of his story, but the mythologizing is a very deliberate tactic on his part.
Just before we go on, I think I share Dee's queasiness about wishing to, you know, go for autobiographical readings of art and, you know, in some ways not doing that psychoanalysis thing. But it strikes me that there are certain aspects of somebody's, you know, I hate to use like an academic term, but contexts, right, that may in some way be impossible to extract from the individual and his work. And I just wonder to what extent him being born in Ireland and coming from a, you know, and obviously a Catholic country and so on, how important is that for understanding Bacon in general? I mean, I know that's a big question, but
okay. Yeah, well, I would say, so first of all, he is described quite properly as a British painter. Now, when he was born in Ireland, Ireland was a province of the United Kingdom. Now, obviously, when we talk about Yeats, we call him Irish. We don't call him British or British Irish, even though he was also born in Ireland when it was part of the British, part of Great Britain. So he has, so Bacon has English parents. He's very strongly attached to English tradition, the English upper class, the English ruling class. So that's why he's quite properly called an Irish-born British painter. I think Dee, who has his own Irish connections, can talk more on this.
Yes, I don't think Bacon has any significant Irish connections other than he was born there and lived there for a time, in his young life. And indeed, of course, his family moved to London when he was, I believe, 5 years old. And for a period he would travel back and forth. So I think the connection to Ireland, I mean, even though, of course, as we'll learn late in the stream, that a significant aspect of his estate was donated to the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin, the connection is just one of the association with the family, I think, rather than anything significant. And they weren't Catholic either. So
yeah, and also before people jump to conclusions, that bequest to the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin was made by his heir. It was not made by Bacon himself.
No.
Bacon did not express any particular. I mean, he wasn't hostile towards Ireland, but he didn't express any particular love of Ireland or the Irish. He never considered himself Irish. He never described himself as Irish. So, and also, we're going to talk about his health in a minute, but his health is related to where he was born and the environment he was in, and that did have a significant impact on his life.
And in fact, once he leaves to go out on his own at a relatively early age, I don't think he ever returned to Ireland again.
I think pretty much, yeah.
So,
I think I think his father died in London. The family had left Ireland by that stage. So yes, I'm not sure that he ever went back.
Just let me know when you want to move on the images.
I mean, just very, very briefly, unless Mr. Adams has more. But he did not have a terribly close relationship with his parents, and again, it's very difficult to sift through what is sort of biographical speculation or not. Not a great relationship with his father either. That he just was not particularly interested in sort of continuing the family business. Now he was not an only child; he was one of 5 children. So, but one gets the sense that that he was a slightly sickly, slightly feckless child. And of course, this again is perhaps part of Bacon's self-mythologizing. But and he had asthma as a child, and this would be important for a number of reasons. It excluded him from military service, and it also played a part in his health, especially his declining health toward the end of his life. So,
and that was why he was privately educated, was because he had such bouts of ill health that he received private tutors, and then later he went to boarding school in I think it's Cheltenham. Yeah. So his mother was Firth, and she came from a family based up in the northeast of England, which made its money through coal. So they were sort of minor coal barons, as it were. Yes, so the father was Edward Bacon, who was a major in the army, I think in the cavalry, and he became a racehorse trainer on the on the east coast of Ireland.
All right, do you want me to flick the image on, D?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the significant point is basically he left home at a quite young age. I mean, perhaps at the time, again, people have to remember this was a very different time, and it was certainly easier for someone to strike out on their own. You could survive with almost nothing in those days. But he basically left home in 1925, at age 15, 16, and went to London and basically.
Sorry, so we should mention that the family moved over to London during the Great War because his father was involved with military service. He was too old to serve, but he was involved. He was working for the War Ministry, I think. So the family was in London during when you had the Easter Uprising. But basically, Bacon claimed that he later remembered that his family was under direct threat as being part of the English upper class. Because of the IRA, so the sort of struggle for independence, as it were, over the sort of 1910s, and that gave him an acute sense of fear and danger as well. So although he didn't live in that situation for very long, he became quite attuned to the atmosphere of violence and threat.
So,
You're going on to don't skip ahead.
Oh, sorry.
We'll skip. Yeah. By the way, that is not the second image. They're out of order.
Oh.
So you need to see if you can sort them by they're numbered sequentially.
All right. Okay. Let me see about that.
Oh, thanks also to Mr. D in advance. I've seen the files, and he's put in a huge amount of work getting lots of great images. So thanks for Mr. D's hard work.
Let's see if it flicks on properly now. Hold on. I think they may have been done in data. Let's have a look now. Is that
there you
right?
go. Yeah,
the next
that's
one?
number 2.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is just one of the very few relatively young images of young Francis Bacon in his early 20s. So again, not a lot of sort of documentary material from sort of his younger days. But as I said, he sort of takes his leave from his family in about 1925, and moves to London basically permanently, and starts working at various jobs. And
do you think it's fair to say? I mean, I'm assuming this picture was taken in the early 20s. Do you think, by the standards of that time, he would have been considered to be quite soft or effete or something like that? Because he looks kind of. I mean, if you look at people from the early 1920s, some of them are quite, they were rough working men at that time. And
this photograph in the catalogue raisonné is dated around 1933, and yes, he was quite sensitive about being seen as sort of effete or feminine, because his face was quite wide, so it sort of had a sort of a flower-like appearance, which he disliked, and he said in a number of interviews that he disliked his own appearance, but he painted the self-portraits because all of the people he knew were dying, and it seemed absurd to paint people who were dead, so he just did self-portraits. But he didn't like his own appearance. Well, he was extremely vain and quite sensitive about his appearance.
I would certainly say that by the standards of the time, and indeed probably by the standards of today as well, he would have been a not the most sort of rough and ready character, I shall say. But again, I mean, he's not from the, he is not of working class extraction, and it was not his inclination. And again, also his health played some role in his relative fragility or seeming fragility.
Yeah, and also this obviously he came into conflict with his father, who was an ex-military man. His brother went to southern Rhodesia, so there was sort of lots of colonial ties, and so the idea of service and vigorous physical exercise, and to do with, and also hunting with horses and dogs, which Bacon couldn't do. He couldn't be around them because he used to get terrible asthma attacks. So he was automatically sort of identified as a sort of weak and unmanly by his own family. So this made him quite touchy about the subject.
Mm-hmm.
So once he moved to London, Mr. Adams, do you want to talk about what his first sort of significant kind of sort of jobs, or his first foray into what he may do as a professional?
Yes. So someone mentioned in the chat that they were looking at the new biography called Revelations. That is an excellent biography. I reviewed it myself, and it's the best one-volume study of his life. So I would recommend that. So yeah. So what happened was, when he moved to London, he worked as a valet, or valet. Sort of a gentleman's gentleman, so he would do things to do with he trained as a cook. He worked he would sort of buy clothes and collect things and make deliveries and so forth and accompany gentlemen. So he was a sort of a gentleman's companion and a general sort of assistant and helper. He also claimed that he lived on the margins of criminality. So he was basically making his living through gentlemen who would buy him food, who would buy him wine, and they would educate him. And so this was how he came. In later years, he became quite sort of renowned as a gourmand and as a lover of the fine things, as someone who drank champagne and sort of spurned lesser wines and lesser vintages and so forth. And he got his education in the 1920s and 30s by basically being a companion to gentlemen in London. He changed positions quite a lot. So because he himself admitted that he was a little bit light-fingered. So I think he got caught a couple of times and had to move on. I think we'll also talk in a minute about Paris and Berlin, but I won't get ahead of myself.
No, I think it's perfectly reasonable to move on. I would say that a very significant thing happened to him in 1926, which is that he traveled to, as Mr. Adams says, traveled to Berlin. Now, of course, having done streams and written and talked about this period of German history, he lived for, I believe, about 2 months initially in Berlin and Munich in 1926, which is just the sort of height of the Weimar period. And he talks he very explicitly talks about this in several interviews, saying that this was his sort of introduction to a kind of louche and bohemian scene. This was his sort of first kind of initiation into into that life, which we all have some idea of what was going on, in the metropolitan areas of Weimar Germany. And with the fullness of the implications of that. So and as I say, he very explicitly says that that was sort of his sort of significant moment.
Yeah. So there was so obviously there was cabaret. There was he was also exposed to sort of advanced art, like so the Neue Sachlichkeit, the New Objectivists, the films of Russian filmmaker, which Mr. D will discuss in a minute. So cabarets. He was also, there was a lot of nightlife, especially gay, homosexual establishments, and this is where he sort of confirmed his taste for having sex with men, and that became. Which was obviously not stigmatized so much in Berlin because there was a whole subculture, there was an underworld of that, and also of prostitution as well. So it played an important part in his development. So he's a mixture of high society, gambling, the underground scene, and advanced art, which kind of primed him.
Just a very quick question. Obviously, the Berlin of that era and the Weimar scene in general, it had, as Dee described it, the louche elements, but it was also, Germany at that time was known for being rife with basically communists. Did Bacon, do we know if Bacon got involved in any political circles around that time? Either on the left or the right, because it was a bit of a hotbed, Berlin, for both.
I can answer that.
Well, please go ahead. Okay.
Yeah.
No, after you.
Well, as far as I know, Bacon was not politically involved in anything in his entire life. He very explicitly. I have actually a short video clip later on. We can watch about where he talks about this, but. As far as I can tell, he was just sort of absolutely apolitical in terms of any actual involvement in sort of temporal politics of any sort. I think he had a disposition which will become clear as we explore his work and his philosophy, which could be described as reactionary, to say the least. But as far as I know, he was never involved in in any sort of politics. I don't know. You may know more about that.
Yes, so he never joined a political party, and certainly when he would have seen the communists in Weimar Germany, of course, he would have known that he was exactly the sort of person that they would have been erasing, as it were, because he was part of the lower ranks of the upper class, as it were, certainly the ruling class. So, he knew that he would be on the sharp end of any revolution. I think he was excited by the Soviet experiment, but he was not politically sympathetic to communism. And his attitude towards the mid-century Germans, as I suppose we're going to have to be calling them for the next half hour or so, he was obviously they weren't in power at this time, but they were a visible presence on the streets. Later on, he came to be very attracted to that aesthetic. And he felt compelled by some of the imagery and some of the emotions relating to that. But again, he wasn't sort of he wasn't politically agitating on any side.
No, I think he would be aesthetically probably much more associated with, let's just say, a more right-wing aesthetic. Again, because of its associations with, sort of, I think, masculinity, formality.
Just better clothes.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, he was very keen on his clothing, as I'm sure Mr. D will describe later on. But so he paid a lot of attention to that.
Yeah. But again, I mean, he was, so of course, in terms of, I think also around this period is when he first really had any kind of cognizance of fine art of period, or expressed really any interest in art at all, as far as I can tell. And as Mr. Adams alluded to, he would have seen a lot of it in Germany. I think the most, I think also it's during this period, and then a subsequent trip to Paris is when he also started to kind of work the first time in a creative field. I mean, excluding his culinary ventures before that, but he began to accept sort of commission for interior design and furniture design around this time, 1926, 27. And so if you go to the next slide, these are slightly later works. This is 1929. But it's these are some of the few sort of surviving works from this period.
Yeah, so he was at this point he was very interested. So he was excited by seeing an exhibit of Picasso in Paris in 1928, I believe, or 1929. And so that kind of excited him to get involved with art, and especially to do with modernism. This isn't close to Picasso, but this was something that he did in response to being excited by modernism.
Yeah, and that first exhibition that he saw was 1927 at Paul Rosenberg, who was a sort of premier gallerist dealing in the kind of the modern artists of the time, Picasso, George Braque, etc. So, and he will see in a few slides, we'll see some of the work that Bacon, from that period of Picasso, which Bacon would have seen, which excited him so much. We've got a lot of sort of examples of artists who kind of formed his core influences, which remained with him for the rest of his life. And he, again, Picasso would be an early, I think, major influence on him that would continue for the rest of his career. So, but again, he saw. This would have been post-Cubist Picasso, but yes, even as you can see with this, as Mr. Adams says, it's not the influence seems more kind of de Chirico, but you certainly see the influence of his viewing of kind of modern art of that period.
Yeah, and also people are going to be a bit surprised that actually at this time he wasn't doing very much oil painting. Oil painting can be a bit tricky, especially when you start. So this is gouache or watercolor, and a lot of this early stuff was related to doing tapestries and also to do with dressing screens. So you've got these dressing screens that you would unfold, and they would often be painted on. So Bacon would be painting on these folding screens that you would have up in your bedroom. So these were frankly decorative works, and only a few of these survived. This was how he was able to sort of suppress this side of his work, because in 1944 he became a serious painter and became acclaimed and so forth. And this was exactly the sort of stuff that he didn't want people looking at. And luckily there was not much of it around, because he was not very successful to start with. So he didn't have very much to hide, because there wasn't much there. And also a lot of it got sort of thrown out or lost, or if you just came across this, you wouldn't recognize this as a Bacon. So if it gets a little bit damaged, you throw it away. And that's why there is so little from this early period.
Yeah. And most of this has only come to light in the past 15, 20 years, certainly significantly after his death. So,
yeah, and also because I'm not sure if this is because owners knew this, but when these sorts of things came up, he would sometimes go into the gallery, buy the picture and destroy it. He would tear it up. He would go in and pay money to go into a gallery and destroy this stuff once he had the money in the sort of like 60s and 70s.
And I have to, just add that I quite admire this. I mean, this is certainly my attitude toward my own work. I like the idea that the artist, it's all about the artist's will. The artist decides where his career begins. The artist decides what you will see. So in a way, I mean, of course, the archivist and collector in me doesn't, laments the loss of all of these works, but the other side of me says, well, as an artist and a man of will, why not? Why do you not get to decide, what people see? Because so much of the process of making art is this vicious and ruthless editing of one's own output. So I am sympathetic to this. Some people may not be. Okay, skip it now. This is another early painting. The next one.
Interesting.
Oh no, this is I believe this is a design for a rug.
Yeah, so and often these rugs would be sort of hung. They would either be on the floor or actually hung on walls. So they were sort of like, in a way, like sort of tapestries, but of course they were woven. Interestingly enough, do you know who owned this painting later on?
I could look, but I don't know offhand. Do you know?
Okay, I can tell you that the catalogue Resonance says that a later owner of this was none other than Valerie Elliott.
Oh.
Don't get too excited. This was in the 1990s, so this was after T.S. Eliot.
Okay.
She was extremely rich widow, and this is something that she bought in her dotage. So
okay, not something she paid.
Tom was never influenced by this, I'm afraid.
Okay, she was. All right, fair enough. That's T.S. Eliot people that think.
Yes, sorry, yeah. So this is obviously influenced by let's say de Chirico, Leussat, French sort of decorative artist, all sorts of so later on Francis Bacon came to sort of whenever he talked about this, and he talked about it very little, he would say, oh well, it wasn't really very serious stuff, it was all influenced by French art, and it was just basically, it was a knockoff of French art. So he was designing tapestries, folding screens. He also made designs for tables, chairs, desks, sort of like plaster wall hangings and stuff. And some of this will sort of actually make a strange recurrence in his later paintings, but most of it was stuff that he disliked and has just been sort of lost. He didn't make that much of it, so there actually wasn't that much to lose.
Very, very quickly, since we brought up T.S. Eliot and Valerie Eliot, there is a lot of evidence that Bacon actually met Eliot in the 1930s, as far as I know. And of course, Bacon was also a lifelong admirer of Eliot's work, and he very specifically references Eliot as the sort of inspiration for various works, including one from 1967, which I like a lot. So the Eliot Bacon connection was there quite strongly from a very early age. He was a poet that Bacon admired quite a bit. Okay, you want to go next?
Yeah, so this is one of the earliest. So this is one of the earliest sort of proper paintings that was made as a painting. Again, influenced by a sort of semi-forgotten artist called Jean Leussat, who was big in the 1920s and 30s. Again, this is also related to neo-romanticism, which become more important in the 1940s. So neo-romanticism was the art movement particularly in Britain, which was sort of a return to romanticism, natural forms, but it also had an undertone of the sinister or the strange or the peculiar, with an overtone of alienation. And this was something that was pursued by people like John Piper and Graham Sutherland, who will come up fairly soon.
Indeed. Bacon always had a peripheral relationship to surrealism, I would say. I don't think he ever really properly sort of embraced it or thought of himself, particularly as a surrealist artist. Although, again, I mean, we're talking about some of these people, and certainly you bring up big names like Chirico or whatever. I mean, obviously there's tangential ties, but I don't think he ever really saw surrealism as a major influence, which is probably odd for people to know, because again, they sort of I think people may make some sort of peripheral connection.
I think he was excited by the idea of surrealist liberation, as it were. So the liberation of the imagination, the combination of the chance combination of images using the subconscious to direct art. So that would have an influence on the work of the 30s and 40s. But yeah, you're right. I think he was sort of on the periphery of surrealism in the same way that some of the neo-romantics were, especially Graham Sutherland. But he never described himself as a surrealist. But I think he was certainly looking at that sort of work in the 1930s. And certainly if you considered French art or Paris to be the epicenter of the art world, which Francis Bacon did, in the 1930s, you would be looking at surrealism.
Okay, you want to skip to the next one?
So here we have one of the dressing screens.
And I believe, you correct me if I'm wrong, that he painted this for one of his early sort of gentleman artistic patrons and teachers called Roy de Maistre.
Quite possibly. It's not in. Yes. Okay. No, it's for Eric Alden. And then you're right. And then it went to Roy de Maistre. Roy de Maistre's an interesting figure because he's like the first serious artist who pays attention to Bacon and sort of takes him under his wing, gives him sort of a basic understanding of materials and of sort of composition and, you know, ways of approaching things. So Bacon advances quite swiftly under Roy de Maistre. De Maistre is interesting also because I think he was clearly infatuated with Bacon, and he was also quite aware that Bacon tended to destroy a lot of his own work, and de Maistre sort of sneakily preserved it, interestingly, by making lots of very detailed paintings of views of the studio. And these would include pictures by Bacon and rugs and screens by Bacon that were in the studio but have later been lost or destroyed. So the Roy de Maistre paintings of the studio are the only records we have of this very scantily documented period of Bacon's working life, because he didn't take many photographs at the time. There was one publication that that photographed his stuff that had 2 photographs of his work in 1930, and apart from that, we've got very little.
Yeah, very, very little. Oh, and before you ask, I don't believe that Roy de Maistre was related to that other de Maistre.
Joseph de Maistre.
One of the questions I had is what are these pillars? What's the? I've noticed that this has been a theme throughout all of these so far.
Oh, this is largely a reference to de Chirico. De Chirico's classicism. So de Chirico was a metaphysical painter, influenced the Surrealists. Famous for his work in the 1910s. He became a classical artist in the 1920s, and with the call to order, you found a lot of avant-garde artists going over to classicism or pseudo-classicism in the 1920s. So the classical references
even Picasso.
Mm.
Yeah. Do you recognise it? It's that fash wave aesthetic. You know how?
Exactly. That's why I kind of asked about the prevalence
neon, a neon bust of someone sitting atop that pillar. Yeah. But again, this screen only just came to light in recent years. You basically, these works will surface and immediately go to auction. But yeah, a very rare supply of this. Yeah, you can go on.
All right. Okay. So, Dee, you can tell us about. You know more about decorating and furnishing than I do, so please go ahead.
Well, so Bacon had some small success as again an interior designer and indeed furniture designer. Now this, from what I've seen of his furniture, it's very much sort of related to a particular strand of modernism. You could sort of associate it with like Charlotte Perriand and Le Corbusier and Paul Généré and those sorts of artists, with certainly a French influence, but very much of its time. And this is from 1930. I can't remember what publication this is.
This is from a magazine called Studio.
Oh, Studio. Okay. And so this would have been very much sort of fashionable, fashionable with it modernist design, and it would have certainly been much more novel to a British audience of the time than it would have been to French and the Germans, where I think a lot of this aesthetic originated. But then, of course, it's people can't see it. Francis Bacon is a young English decorator. His work in Paris and Germany for some years and is now established in London. We have been perhaps slower than other nations in adapting ourselves to new ideas in furnishing and decoration, but are gradually becoming accustomed to discriminating between what really is new and good in modernist interiors and what is new and bad. The appeal of steel and glass is a strong one, and Francis Bacon shows us individualistic variations on this theme. His rugs are particularly representative of today, and their inspiration springs from nothing oriental or traditional. They are purely thought forms. There you go. And also, I think it's quite interesting that his rugs / tapestries or his textiles they're very prominently signed. In fact, you can see his signature there, quite large at the bottom there, Francis Bacon, on the bottom of that hanging. So,
sorry, go on.
Well, no, I was just going to say the next slide is also a continuation of this feature.
Yeah, so I think this is interesting. There are only a handful of photographs. If anyone goes to my WordPress site, which is Alexander Adams art.wordpress.com, you'll find a review I did of something called the Bacon Review, which is sort of a periodical. And they reproduce some high quality photographs of this photo shoot. Which are just being digitized now. They've just been scanned and they're being digitized. There are not very many photographs beyond these few, I'm afraid. But it's interesting that some of these, he was extremely well connected. So Bacon had connections in London, because you'll remember that he was sort of being a gentleman's gentleman, and he moved in some fairly high circles, and he got some good patronage. I believe that some of his advanced furniture ended up with Patrick White, the novelist, and also Rab Butler, the Labour politician, owned one of Bacon's desks, one of his modernist desks. So there were people in the art world and the decorative world, especially in the modernist scene in London, which was extremely small. I mean, there was absolutely very little market for this at all. This was considered extremely cutting edge, even though, you know, it had been done in France for sort of about 10 years by now. And it was considered very advanced and sophisticated and vanguard. And in order to get these high profile clients, Bacon had to be introduced to many of them. So I'm really fascinated about all the people that Bacon would have met, because this was a very small set, and so they all knew each other. And he was introduced by influential people to actual manufacturers, because Bacon didn't make any of this himself, apart from the paintings. He had this all made for him.
Yeah, this is all. And there were enough of these produced that you do see multiple examples of them. There's not just like one. You know, there were obviously some number of them produced. The other thing that this picture is interesting to me, this is my own theory, and I would have to find some way to confirm this, but very prominently in Bacon's studio, the studio that has come to be associated most strongly with him, where he worked for most of his career at 7 Rees Mews, there is a round mirror. And I've always wondered if it is one of these mirrors that he designed with these suites of furniture.
I believe it is. I believe that's the only piece that he kept, and
I'm not
sure. And I'm not sure that he ever sort of announced it or sort of proud of it or whatever. But yeah, I believe that is the round mirror that was in the studio.
Okay, I've always noticed that ever since I saw these pictures. So I wondered about that. I mean, it's in terrible nick. You know, most of them, a lot of the silvering is sort of corroded and such. But yeah, so very, very interesting that he probably kept it as more of a useful item, obviously, than a reminder of his past.
I'm actually just struck by how little. I mean, looking at these images, I could walk into any furniture store today, and it would look a little bit similar to this, you know, in terms of the design, in terms of what you look at.
A lot of these great periods have never left us. I mean, I think partially, in the most cynical terms, it's because it's very, even though probably these would not have been cheap to produce, and they certainly would be cheap to buy, but this type of modernist furniture is fairly cheap to produce, so hence why you see so much of it. You know?
And also, we also should mention that some of this furniture and decoration of this design was being made by the Bauhaus group in Weimar, Germany. So Bacon may have encountered this as early as 1928 or something in Weimar, Germany.
Yeah, you get you know, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Marcel Breuer, and you get all the big names who designed a lot of furniture using these materials and this general aesthetic. So yeah, I would be surprised if Bacon hadn't had some contact with it. Okay, and here's some sort of more recent photos of a couple of these surviving pieces, and that they go for a lot at auction.
I believe these are in the foundation at Monaco.
Okay.
Yeah, so this will probably come up later, but there is a foundation which is based in Monaco, which has an astonishing collection of Bacon art, archives, documentary material, and I believe they also have these 2 pieces of furniture there.
Okay, I've certainly seen examples of that stool come up at I can't remember if it was Sotheby's or Christie's, but again, there's a few of them about, and they go for extraordinary amounts of money because of course they have both interest for collectors of design of that period, as well as obviously his connection as a later great painter. So this it ties into this sort of revelatory that I mentioned he saw at Paul Rosenberg in Paris in 1927, and this is these are works that Picasso was producing around this time. Would you like to talk a bit about this? Since
yeah, so this was Picasso's so-called Dinard period. Dinard is a small holiday resort on the French coast in the north of France, Normandy, I believe it is. So Picasso used to go there with his family, and of course, being Picasso, he brought his mistress as well, separately, of course. And he would be out there with his wife and his son, and then he would sort of nip into a bathing cabin and have sex with his very young mistress, which was apparently what you do when you're a successful artist. And
How does she feel about being painted in this way?
Yeah. So this is obviously a sort of a highly symbolic and allegorical depiction. So it's metaphorical rather than literal. Yeah.
It's very odd.
Yes.
So this period of Picasso's work, which you know, I would say broadly is kind of biomorphic abstraction. I mean, it's a very. I mean, first of all, I think that it was probably at least partially Picasso's response to surrealism, which, you know, he sort of had peripheral interests around the time. But these are very, very odd and very weirdly menacing and aggressive pictures. As you'll see, I've got examples of from not this group but others from the period. But you know, again, I this is why it was so certainly so striking to young Francis Bacon at the time. You know, these were very very oddly impressionable pictures. These I remember seeing these when I was quite young and be quite scandalized by them. So.
And interestingly, they're also, I mean, they feel quite monumental. They're very simplified. The shading's quite basic. You've got reduction in color and so forth. But actually, these paintings are tiny. I mean, they are just like 10 inches by 10 inches. You know? Yeah,
these Dinard paintings are very, very small. But it's also the idea of again, you know, again, Picasso there nipping off with his mistress, and of course his very strong but also very ambivalent sort of feelings and connections to women in general. You know, also, I mean, I don't know if Bacon, if that was also a factor in Bacon's sort of interest and admiration of these pictures, but the idea of woman as monster comes up so many times in this general area of Picasso's career. And appealing to me, but I don't know if it appealed to Bacon for similar reasons.
I just love to think that his mistress would be like, listen, Pablo, I don't have one leg which is a bone and another leg which is a dolphin. What the hell is this?
I think if you were Picasso's mistress, you knew what you were getting into.
Yes. Also, I should say that so Bacon admired certain artists very much. He was very discriminating about what he said about living artists, because he was actually quite jealous.
Yeah.
He admired Picasso not unreservedly but greatly, more than anyone else, and there were two reasons for that. Firstly, it was because Bacon, probably because three reasons, because Picasso was extremely inventive and creative, He developed whole new languages, opened up whole new avenues of pictorial thought. Secondly, he was extremely influential. He was a great painter. He was a great man, sort of Carlylean great man who had a massive amount of influence on art. And thirdly, he also was an autobiographical painter. And Bacon wanted very often to make art that was great and powerful and in a classic tradition, but was also personal and autobiographical, and that he could paint his own autobiography in a rather indirect way. So these were three reasons why Bacon was a huge admirer of Picasso. And later on, he had catalogues of his sent to Picasso, and I think Picasso was sort of muttered, "Oh, this is strong stuff," but Picasso again was also quite jealous, so he wouldn't say very much publicly.
No, and of course, later on, Bacon became the only other living artist that received the great honor of an exhibition at Palais.
The Grand Palais in Paris.
Grand Palais in Paris. So in a way, and I would say that, that there was certainly a very interesting relationship. But yes, as we'll see, and there's also a video clip which we should perhaps play in a bit, just to get a flavor for how Bacon talked and how he thought about things. But he was very critical of contemporary artists, but also very critical of himself. In fact, I would say that the artist he was most vocally critical of was himself and his own art. He was quite candid about his own relative dissatisfaction when he had what he considered failure. So it wasn't just jealousy and cattiness. He was also very demanding of his own work. So, I'm gonna go on. We'll see some more Picassos. I love this one.
My God.
What is that cursed term that's just a bonus hole? There you go.
Gosh, I mean,
come on.
Is that all I am to you, Pablo?
Yeah, so I'm afraid there's no getting away from that. That's the kind of artist that Picasso was.
Yeah, but I mean, again, this idea of treating the human form in this way is really sort of shocking, and again, something that I think freed Bacon up to do similar things in his own work, and of course the idea. I mean, of course, this is, people say, well, this is abstract, this isn't realist, but I mean, Bacon, of course, would claim over and over again that his work was entirely concerned with the real, and concerned with the depiction of things. Not with the depiction of things optically, but the sort of metaphorical and morphological implications of the human body and human flesh, and flesh as meaning, and the rearrangement of the body and the face and other parts of the physiognomy and indeed the physical world in the paintings, in a way that expressed something other than just, again, the mere appearance of something, which Bacon always called illustration. He was very adamant that there was a type of painting that he hated, which he called mere illustration. But you'll see, of course, with some of his other influences, that he was also a great admirer of great classical artists as well. So, and you can do both. This is something that I think a lot of people are quite reticent. They have an interest in in a broader understanding of plastic arts, painting, and different types of paint, different ways of depicting the world. But they may be sort of, say, I've got to stick with this one genre, because it seems more acceptable than the other. But I think there's other ways of looking at the world. I am quite Catholic in my taste and my inspiration. So I think it's good to remind people that you don't just have to say, well, I hate this, I hate that, I only like this. Okay.
I've never seen Picasso's like this before. I've seems like every time I look at a Picasso, I'm looking at something different. You know, I've not come across these ones before.
Yeah, and these are not reproduced as much as the other ones, because for obvious reasons it is just too rude, I think.
Yeah, and a lot of his work is very raw. He was not concerned with conventional ideas of decorum or taste, and neither was Francis Bacon. And also, as Mr. Adams says, these are also, many of them are very small, and for various reasons, a lot of certainly public galleries don't. They tend not to display these works. They tend not to display work in the scale, and certainly with this subject matter. Okay, there we go. This is from 1929, slightly later from Picasso.
Had he moved on to a different mistress at this time, or?
No, this was still the same one, but she was So this is more sort of more biomorphic. Well, the last one's biomorphic, but if you look at artists like Jean Arp, the German sculptor, and Yves Tanguy, whose work I recently reviewed on my WordPress site, you'll see that there are some similarities between this. Picasso was very good at getting something, adapting it, sort of composting it into his own manner, and then moving on to something else. But sort of hugely inventive.
Okay.
Still Picasso.
This is Picasso. What date is this one? This is late 20s, isn't it?
Yeah, this is I believe 1929. I believe.
Yes. So this was just when he was when he wanted to get divorced. He wanted to get divorced. I mean, like, big surprise. This is his attitude towards women during a point when he wanted to get divorced. His wife was an Orthodox Christian from Russia, and she would not divorce him. So they were basically married until she died.
Yeah, she never granted him.
She never granted it.
Yeah, her name was Olga Koklova. I don't know if that's exactly how it's pronounced, but that's how I do it.
Yeah, so they got married in the Great War, and anyway, we shouldn't spend too much time on this. But anyway, this was Picasso giving vent to what he thought about women while he was in the process of trying to get a shot of his wife.
I love it. This is quite imposing. It's quite a large painting. This is in the Picasso Museum in Paris, a wonderful museum if you've never been. Okay. I think I've got a couple more.
Speaks to me deeply.
So this is another one from around 1930 or so. This is him responding to surrealism. This was his so-called bone period, because he would sort of build these fantastical constructions, humanoid constructions, out of sort of bones or sort of weathered stones and so forth. And these became ersatz monuments. So you can see that, you can imagine this as being something vast that you would have on a hilltop. But again, this is just a small painting. And it just shows you how powerful and inventive Picasso was. And that was, of course, what influenced Bacon. And that's why we're looking at so many of these.
Go on. I think there's one more Picasso. Yeah.
Yep. And that's another one. So this is that sort of bone period thing. So it's like figures being made out of objects. And in the background, you can see one of the bathers' cabins from Dinard, and of course, it's set on the beach at Dinard.
Yeah, and this is quite a late one from this period. This is 1931. So, wonderful picture, that one. Okay.
Oh, okay, Dee. Tell us about this.
Well, I just thought there was a natural transition to insectoid devouring women and Cronus and Saturn devouring his son. This is a painting by Goya, the great Spanish artist who lived in the 18th and early 19th century, and another I think quite influential figure for Francis Bacon. And this painting in particular, I believe that, I wasn't able to find it, but I believe that this is one of the many reproduction clippings that he had floating around his studio for years. So,
Yeah.
you want to say anything specific about this? Ooh, no.
Oh no, no, not really. I mean, I think that Picasso, Bacon, kind of rather perversely, he when people would mention Goya to him, and they would say, "Oh, the black paintings," because this is considered one of the black paintings. Oh, you must have been influenced by Goya, and he would say, no, quite the opposite. I really love his formal portraits, and you do often find with Bacon's statements that he's deliberately obscuring direct references, and we'll get to that when we talk about some contemporary artists who clearly did influence Bacon, and Bacon was like, no, quite the opposite, dear boy.
Yeah. Indeed. I think most people are probably familiar with this picture. The so-called black paintings were a suite of pictures that Goya painted for his own house, and it's I would say they're varying, quite disturbing imaginations. I mean, talk about black pilling. There's it's very interesting, the idea.
Talk about doom scrolling.
Yeah, talk about doom scrolling. I mean, making that suite of pictures to decorate your own house. And again, if people want to look into it, you'll see what I mean. Covens of witches and old toothless men, gnawing at food, and cats fighting in the moonlight. Okay.
All right, so this is Nicolas Poussin, Massacre of the Innocents. So this was Herod giving the order for children to be killed, because of course it was sort of to do with the prophecy of the coming of Christ and so forth. So this is this is Massacre of the Innocents, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is in Chantilly, which is outside Paris. Apparently, when Bacon went to stay in Paris, which we haven't actually properly explained, he went to Paris in, I think it was in 1927 for the first time. He went there a couple of times over this period when he was just starting up as a designer, and or just before he started up as a designer, and he was really excited by Picasso, and he was excited by this painting by Poussin, because he thought that the painting of the Scream was as powerful, as real as any painting of that scream, of that expression that had ever been done, and that's what excited him. He was living in Paris in a suburban house with a family. It's a bit weird to think of how we understand Bacon later on, but he was living with a family. He was like sort of as an au pair, and he was basically looking after the children and being their companion and stuff, and while he was learning French. And he did become, I wouldn't say fluent in French, but he learned to speak French very well and very expressively.
And quite good conversational French. Yeah, yes. And there are interviews with him in French. So.
Yes, he would later on in his life, he would spend a fair amount of time in Paris and Monaco. So yes,
and he even had a studio in France for many years, and worked there occasionally. Okay, there's a detail of this picture next. This is the figure. Yeah, this is a detail, and this is I think Bacon described this as the perfect depiction of the human cry. There is a lot of Bacon has a lot of interest in some of his early work with the human mouth, and there's early interviews where he talks about this. His again part of his own mythology was that he was in Paris and went to a bookshop, a secondhand bookshop, and found an old medical textbook which was hand colored, as many early books were, and it was a book about diseases of the mouth, and he always mentions this book. It's brought up in quite a number of his interviews.
And he talked about the beauty of the color, and then he said that this inspired him to do a painting of a scream where the open mouth would be the same color as a Monet painting of a landscape.
Yes, which he never did. I mean, in fact, I remember there's one of those David Sylvester interviews where David Sylvester says, "Yeah, but Francis, all your mouths are black," and it's true. Most of them are completely colorless. So
yeah,
very odd. Okay.
So, of course, this is Edward Munch, The Scream, sort of 1890 something.
This version would have been 1893. There are four or five versions. If you include the lithograph, the graphic version, I believe there are 5 versions of this subject.
And at any one time, one of them has been stolen.
yeah. A number of them have been stolen for some reason. I believe one of them is in private hands.
And the rest are in museums in Norway, I believe.
In Norway, yeah. And everyone knows this picture. I mean, in fact, if you go to your if you're on Twitter or something, you go to the emojis, and there is literally this scream emoji is taken from this figure. But obviously, again, a repeating early concern for Francis Bacon. I don't know if I ever heard him talking about this particularly, but he certainly would have known about these.
Well, he didn't talk about Munch, but interestingly enough, Bacon's works and his life have been analysed in a way that virtually no other artists have, because people have had more access to his stuff since his death than anyone else. So a lot of the Picasso stuff, Picasso was reading, and he had lots of books and lots of letters and so forth, but a lot of it was stolen or hidden or shuffled between various relatives to keep it out of the eye of the tax authorities. But Bacon's stuff has been very thoroughly documented. So we'll talk about the studio later on, but there was a project recently to analyze all the books that were in his house when he died. Now, obviously, that's not all the books he ever read or ever saw, because he had lots of books that he gave away or threw away or got nicked. Especially sort of, I imagine lots of signed copies of stuff from friends got nicked. But one of the books that was in his collection when he died was the Thames and Hudson Dolphin series on Edward Munch. So yes, he was looking at Munch, and he knew Munch's work very well. But this is an avenue that's not perhaps discussed as much as it should be.
Mm. Okay. You want to have a go, or
no, you please go ahead, Mr.
Well, this is a very famous image. It's a cropped still from a film, a Russian silent film called Battleship Potemkin, which was made in 1925 by the sort of great Soviet modernist filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, and the film is about, I believe, about a mutiny that occurred aboard a Imperial Russian Navy ship, a mutiny of the crew. It's been many years since I've watched it, but quite a famous film. The film is divided up into sort of these various acts, and they're at the penultimate act of the film, Act 4, is called the Odessa Steps, and there's it basically depicts when the citizens of Odessa sort of like mob out to show their support for the Potemkins, for the mutinying crew of the Potemkin, and then there's the Cossacks like open fire, and it's a very famous film sequence. And this is a nurse who is sort of followed as one of the kind of characters in this sequence, kind of an au pair, nanny looking after a child in a pram, and so this image Bacon had in his studio. It was actually up on the wall of his various studios for quite a number of years. And in fact, that the clipping that Bacon kept survives. Well, we'll see it later on. But again, this image was very powerful and striking to him. Again, for this sort of moment of violence, and also the idea of the human cry, you know.
Yeah, so this was quite widely reproduced in books and magazines at the time. So that was how Bacon was able to access it, because he sort of referred to it in. There were a couple of paintings later on, which there was one that's almost a direct transcript of this.
Yeah.
So he actually had this reproduced on paper, because obviously there was no such thing as home video or anything, and he didn't have a film projector and so forth. Interestingly, well, or maybe not interestingly, do you know who wanted to study film under Eisenstein in the 1930s? Someone you wouldn't expect.
No.
Samuel Beckett. Apparently he drafted a letter to Eisenstein saying, I'd like to come to Moscow and study film under you. But he either didn't send it or he didn't get a positive reply, because he ended up not going to Moscow.
Interesting. I thought you were going to say Stalin. Didn't Stalin like him as well?
For a while, he fell out of favor, Eisenstein, as most people did.
For a period, he liked him.
Yeah, I believe it was Eisenstein's. He late made a trilogy about Ivan the Terrible and Ivan IV of Russia, and Stalin was not pleased by part 2 or part 3 of that, part 4.
I don't want to derail too much, but Stalin famously got Hollywood movies like secretly sent to him, because he was a secretly big film buff, apparently. So.
Did he force everyone to watch them?
I didn't like, he had like private viewings of like Disney.
Yeah, he had like a cinema for, everyone. No, we're going to watch it. We're going to watch it again. We're going to watch it twice, and you're going to watch it with me.
I think the Austrian painter was also a fan of cowboy movies, as I recall. He used to have them privately screened.
Interesting.
I believe also Stalin, for some reason, at one point ordered the assassination of John Wayne. I don't know for what reason, but
John Wayne was a very big coal warrior, so not that surprising. But all right, shall we? Carry? Oh, just on the subject of movies and Bacon. Obviously he was in Germany for a period. Do you know if he came across, because there were quite a lot of great German filmmakers around that time. Fritz Lang spring to mind, but there were a number of others as well.
Yeah.
Do you know if he was a fan of any of those, or if he came across them?
I think he did. He spoke about being excited by expressionist cinema. He when he was interviewed later in life, they said, is there anything that you would have been if you hadn't been a painter? And he said, yes, I would have. If I'd been born, I think I'd been born a little bit later, I would have become a filmmaker or something. He was really fascinated by films, and especially classic films from the 30s and so forth, and also silent films from the 20s and so forth. So he did express a great love for cinema and for high cinema, as it were, and I think he hankered to do that sort of thing. Yeah. So, Mr. D, do you want to explain why Rembrandt is here?
So Bacon also greatly admired Rembrandt, especially I think for Rembrandt's self-portraits. I mean, Bacon was a great self-portraitist and turned to himself as subject many, many times. And of course, Rembrandt is known also for using himself as a subject throughout his career. In fact, you can sort of track, the kind of vicissitudes of Rembrandt's life through his various self-portraits. This is from 1669, so it's a relatively late one. but yes, I mean, various artists, particularly Rembrandt and another artist that we'll see soon. I think interested Bacon so much because of their their sort of ruthless depictions of themselves and their own flesh. And if you go to the next picture,
I think I don't know if it was this particular one, but I went to Amsterdam and they were absolutely low. I mean, they're all in one hall.
Yeah.
It's been about 30 of them, wasn't it? Just a huge number of Rembrandt self-portraits. So he did a lot of them. They're kind of fascinating in and of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And also something that excited, well, if you go to the next one, something that particularly excited Bacon was the technical virtuosity of the paintings, because this is something that Bacon would get involved in later on when we became. So you remember he started out making watercolors and stuff, and he wasn't really making oil paintings. Later on, he became a consummate painter, and he was very interested in applying paint in different ways, with brushes, with bits of cloth, with his fingers and so forth. And he took a lot of inspiration from the flexibility of Rembrandt, and this was really quite radical painting from Rembrandt. So Rembrandt and Titian are really painters, and Bacon admired both Titian and Rembrandt.
I will advise people also that I mean, when you sort of look at art, I mean, I post art tweets or when we have these streams and things like that. I mean, it's sort of just a primer, because you certainly for most of these pictures, you really got to see them. I mean, it's certainly with Rembrandt, just to see how the paint is applied and how it's miraculous in some cases. Again, how he achieves these sort of visual effects through not only like just the sort of surface manipulation, just through building up and through texture and through there's all sorts of things happening, and you can't really see that unless you look at them in person. So I certainly urge people, again, we have this idea, well, now we've got high res, we don't need to go look at them anymore. You're never going to see, you're never going to sense of the scale, you're never going to have that sort of intimate experience with the surface of the painting. And it's important with Bacon, although Bacon confounds that in a way that we'll talk about in a bit. But I would certainly urge people, if you've never really looked at any of these pictures, particularly these Rembrandts or any of the other sort of great artists, you've really got to see them. So take advantage of that opportunity. I believe that this picture is in the same museum as the Poussin that we looked at earlier. If I'm not...
so this is in Chantilly as well.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken. I want to check that, because I feel like
I think it's only later on he gets into Rembrandt. So to start off with, he's interested in Poussin. He gets he's interested in Picasso as well, and these are the sort of painters he likes. Also the Impressionists. He's quite excited, I think, by Renoir as well, who's not on your list, but I mean, I thought maybe he is on your list.
Sorry, very briefly, I was mistaken. This painting is in Aix-en-Provence, Musée Granette. The other is
okay,
yeah. So next, this is, of course, I would say, in terms of influences, Velasquez is the artist who looms very large, a self-professed lifelong favorite artist of Francis Bacon.
Yeah, so this is the portrait of Pope Innocent X, I think.
Yeah.
From the what sort of 1650 or something like that.
Yeah, 1650.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so this is actually this is a painting that's in a gallery in Rome. Bacon did travel quite a lot, and he visited Rome, and people said, "Oh, what did you think of the painting when you finally saw it in person?" And he said he couldn't bear to go and see it in the gallery because he'd done such terrible things, as we'll see later on. He had done such terrible versions himself. He couldn't bear to face the brilliance of the original. Bacon often liked to experience art through the medium of reproduction, through book illustration. So he could look at things and in his leisure, he could put things side by side. He could also manipulate the paper, scrunch it up, sort of the paint would fall on it or get smudged on it, and that would excite him and lead him through a process of subconscious association, which is very surrealist, towards new images which he would either describe or would appear on the canvas as he was painting himself.
Yeah, I mean, part of the way it wasn't that he was just looking at this art. It was also that the actual physical reproductions. And of course, remember, this is the Zoomers. These are the days when there were no screens, except a television screen. But if you wanted to experience anything, it had to have been printed either in a book or in a periodical of some sort. But it would also be not just the influence of the actual painting, Velasquez, being reproduced but as Mr. Adams says, also the actual physical reality of the reproduction. And you'll see that every single thing, every scrap that came out of Bacon's studio seemed like it went through the absolute ringer, through the wars. I mean, they are battered, they are torn, they are crumpled, they are spattered. And I do think that, yes, again, this was part of the process and part of how he would come to other association things.
And I think, and I think there's recently been a book. I'm not sure which one it was because I've reviewed so many Francis Bacon books. If you go through my channels, you'll find that I've done 10 or 12, 15 reviews or something, and that's not all of them because some of them are just printed. There was a book I think relatively recently, probably by Martin Harrison, who's written most of the really good books recently, where they had a double page spread in this book of all the different versions of this painting which had been found in Bacon's studio, and they're all of different print qualities, and they've all been sort of tattered and battered and spattered and torn and stuff in different ways. And it's really interesting just to look at the differences between sort of 8 different versions, because he used to not only would he have books, he would actually tear out pages that he was really interested in, even expensive rare books. He would just tear out pages.
He was not a bibliophile in that way. No, he was not kind to his book.
And since his death, we'll have a look at the studio later on, but since his death, there was a whole project to scan every single page, every single leaf of printed matter, including, just scientific books, art books, newspaper pages, newspaper supplements, snapshots, automat booth photographs. They've all been scanned. And so, for example, I think if you just go to the Hugh Lane Gallery website, I think, or the Francis Bacon Estate website, you can go to these places and just click archive, and you can just click through a whole series of pages which came from his studio. And it's really interesting to see if you can relate any of those to specific paintings.
I just wanted to say that since sitting and looking at this man for the past 5 minutes, I am sorry for the things I've done.
Good. You should
that's your whole confession, is it?
Well, look at him. Look at him.
Well, I will say that this picture, I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration. I can't remember who said that this is perhaps the greatest oil portrait of all time. I can't remember who wrote that, but I might not be able to narrow it down, but this is certainly a monumentally great portrait. And Velasquez, of course, was an utter master. Yes, and of course Bacon would come to regret his processing of this particular work of art. I think he came to do all of the many versions of this as a mistake.
Yeah, I think he felt that it was sort of jejune or something. I don't know.
Yeah. There was just nothing he could add to this picture. Next, and this just gives you a flair for. This is this is an early picture. I don't know if this is from his Kensington studio or I'm not sure. But
I think isn't this Sam Hunter 53, something like that.
Yeah, but this is a picture of detail of Bacon's studio wall, and you can see there's all sorts of things there. There are various characters represented there. Let's just say, from Charles Baudelaire to others.
Yeah, and the one in the middle by the Velasquez is a crime scene photograph. So Bacon was very excited by crime photographs, so sort of bodies and crime scenes and so forth. You got the third man there. You also have a scene from, I think it was a reenactment of the, no, I think maybe it was a real scene from the Russian Revolution as well.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but
some other characters in the upper left-hand corner.
Didn't Warhol go through a period of collecting?
Oh yeah, well, I mean Warhol had famously did a whole series of pictures called Disasters, which are basically sort of very uses their source very graphic accident photographs. So there are a lot of parallels. I also would invite people to link some of the things that to link Bacon and Warhol. It's very. I think it's always elucidating to sort of take two artists, especially two artists who lived contemporaneously. Although Warhol was quite a bit younger than Bacon, but and sort of compare and contrast their work.
I still can't get over how good that Pope Innocent is, by the way. It's just an incredible. Yeah. All right.
So of course another great inspiration for Bacon being a figurative artist and almost most of Bacon's work being involved with the human body, particularly the male body, was Michelangelo. These are obviously drawings by Michelangelo. This being a study for the figure of Adam that appears in the Sistine Chapel frescoes. But obviously, to pick a word, I recall from an interview with Bacon, it's the voluptuous. That Michelangelo was a sort of master of the and progenitor of the idea of the voluptuous male body in art.
Yeah, so he spoke very much about being excited about, because obviously he was homosexual, and this sort of shaped his taste, and also artistically speaking, that he was much more interested in the male body than the female body. And obviously the male body has been a staple of certainly heroic art from the ancient times onwards. And so he was really excited by the drawings of Michelangelo, which he liked much more than the paintings.
Indeed, and they're absolutely masterful. These various drawings. The Royal Collection, I believe, holds quite a number of them. Not as many as they have Leonardo drawings, but yeah. Okay. So another great influence, perhaps Mr. Adams could talk about, not a painter at all, but a Victorian photographer.
Yes, Edward Mybridge. Edward spelt in a particularly weird way. I don't
Which I learned recently was an affectation. He actually changed the spelling of his name because he wanted it to seem more archaically British.
Yeah, so he was Yeah, so he was a photographer who's working in the sort of 1880s to 1900 period, and his great development was using glass plate, high sensitivity photo plates, glass plates, to record action, especially sequential action. So what he would have is he would set up a row of cameras, and he would get a person to walk in front of a black screen, and they would and what would happen is it would trigger a series of photographs of these down the line. So the cameras would go off one by one, and then these photographs could be put together and in sequence, and so you could see animal and human locomotion. So he published a whole series of books called Animal and Human Locomotion. So this was documenting male and female and also children in movement. So there'd be running, walking, throwing a stone, picking something up. Here, this is one of wrestlers. He also did a series of animals, and including dogs, horses, I think there's some of chickens and various other animals. He also, interestingly, did some of disabled people. So people with spinal deformations who would be walking in a very peculiar way. But anyway, of course, this was of great interest to artists. This became a great source book for artists because this was recording things that had never been seen before, because they were momentary. So they had to be recorded on cameras, and now photography was sensitive enough to capture these images quickly. And these could be published in sequence. And this was the period when people discovered that horses did not run with all four legs off the turf. Because previously you'll look at sporting pictures, British sporting pictures from the 17th and 18th century, and you have the horse sort of basically flying through the air, front legs forward, back legs back, and there's sort of nothing touching the ground and sort of floating through the air like Superman. That's not how horses run. But no one, of course, had definitive proof until you had photography of it, and this was something that Edward Mybridge was particularly famous and celebrated for.
And also I think he should also be, and well, he is, in many cases, celebrated as a pioneer of cinema, because it really was not a big leap from this type of sequential photography to the idea of actual cinema, putting the frames together and projecting them in a way that you could actually see this motion. And you can find many examples where people have taken the various frames from a Mybridge series and animated them, turn them into like animated GIFs.
There were magic lanterns and zoetropes and so forth, where you would actually look through a slot in a revolving metal drum, and on the inside of the drum there would be a light, and they would be these photographs in order, and you would basically see it's an early form of cinema.
Yep. So very interesting, and also fascinatingly is that the way that Mybridge captured these images is quite similar to how they did the early special effects in the Matrix films, where they did that sort of, I don't know what they called it, that kind of weird motion. They set up a series of SLR
bullet time, I think, isn't it?
Bullet time, that's it. Yes, and took, again, automatically triggered sequential photographs, and it was very much the same way that these were captured, just in a more primitive setup. But certainly Bacon was also just absolutely obsessed with photography, and just every sort of image. He just he sort of relished and dissected.
Very interesting. I'm looking for those disabled pictures. kind of interested. But anyway, carry on.
There's also one of an enormously fat man, which is quite interesting. A naked, like 35 stone man running. So seek that one out as well.
So I have to do that in my own time. But I mean, I think these are incredibly famous. These, you see them every.
Yeah.
I don't know, like you'll randomly see them up in a pub or something, like, you know, reproductions of these I'm talking about. Especially the horse ones. I'm sure I've seen lots of times.
Yeah, those are frequently published. This is you can always tell which of these comes directly from Bacon's studio because it's just a mangled disaster. But this is actually a reproduction of one of the Mybridge things that was found in his studio.
I've just checked something that I knew, but I'd forgotten the details of. Apparently, he was his wife had an affair. He tracked down the man and shot him dead, and was tried for murder. But apparently, he got off. But
I didn't know that. Wow.
He can be inducted to the roles of the based.
Mybridge didn't know that. I did not know that.
Yeah. So Flores' wife filed for divorce. Mybridge was tried for murder in 1875.
Wow.
Yeah. So he was acquitted on the grounds of justifiable homicide. Justifiable homicide. Well, you are needed. Where are you? Let's put out the call to justifiable homicide.
Oh.
Okay. Let's carry on. Yeah.
I think that this is a series of young women, and you can see that actually one of the images Bacon has put ink or gouache or paint, sort of isolating the figure there in the center. So these are very much used in one way or the other as part of this.
That image that you can see isolated there, that was actually the basis for a fairly accurate transcription, I think, in 1961. So there's actually a painting of that. We should mention also that there was something called the Jewel Archive. Do you want to say something about that, Mr. D?
I don't know a lot about the details of that. I know how that sort of
I'll go over that.
Yeah.
I'll go over that briefly. So what happened was someone called Barry Jewell, who's a Canadian man, was a close neighbour of Bacon in the 1970s and 1980s. He became his handyman, and he was entrusted with removing sacks full of basically stuff like this, material like this. Books, newspapers and stuff, because it would just sort of accumulate on the floor. We'll see photographs of that later. But he was and he would also throw away old Bacon paintings, paintings that Bacon rejected. And after Bacon's death, he came forward and said, actually, well, I've got this archive of material which has come from Bacon's studio, and it is of historical significance, and I don't want to sell it, but can I loan it on long-term loan to the Tate? The Tate looked at this material and gave a qualified yes to it. They said, oh, this emanates from his studio. But interestingly, they didn't say, oh, this is the work of Bacon. Because what happened was it was a whole bunch of photographs from books, magazines, newspapers and stuff, which had been manipulated in this way. But the crux was the manipulations looked a bit odd. It looked a bit systematic. There were some odd materials used that Bacon had never used in authenticated stuff, the stuff that was found in his studio. The stuff that came from the archive was different from the stuff that was on the studio floor. And there was a thought that someone, for legal reasons, I'm not going to say who, someone had made this work and that it was not Bacon's. Subsequently, the Tate changed its mind about the Jewel Archive and decided that they no longer wished to loan it, and it was returned to Mr. Jewell. And I say no more for legal reasons.
Exactly.
I'm so sorry to do this, but while you guys were talking, I couldn't help. I had to have a look.
Oh, no.
This is Gargantuan Woman Walking. So there we go.
Oh, it's a woman. Oh, I thought it was a man. I didn't know it was a woman.
It's a woman, and I don't know what's happening there. What's happening? I mean, this is someone who's it's just
Who wants to explain it to me? Who wants to explain it to AA? I'm not going to explain it.
No, I'm not going to do it.
but,
This is not only demonetized. This stream will now be erased from the YouTube search.
no,
that
I think
drooping apron of fat over the genitalia is that there's a term for it in medicine called pannus, which of course comes from the Latin word bread. So you can make your own association.
I just I found it really funny that I found that image through a left-wing book called "Stigmatizing Bodies."
That's where I saw it as well. Stigmatizing fat bodies or something. Yeah.
Anyway, let's go back to our Victorian totty here.
Dear.
All right.
Okay, so this is a painting by Chaim Soutine, the Lithuanian-born painter who lived most of his life in France. Famous for his paintings from the 1910s, 20s, and early 30s, and the 1930s, of landscapes, portraits, and here this is a carcass. So he did some famous paintings of beef carcasses. So he did still lifes of dead animals. The beef carcasses are considered his masterpieces, and now are sort of distributed amongst the great museums of the world. And Bacon himself was very excited and enthused about Soutine. Well, he was to begin with, and this really influenced his work in the 1940s and 50s. Bacon was obviously looking at this. He even spoke about this in interviews. Later on, he became a lot more reticent, and the old sort of the jealousy and the paring down occurred, and Bacon just sort of stopped talking about Soutine in the way that he stopped talking about certain other artists, modern artists, because he just didn't really want to be compared to them. He wanted people to talk about him in terms of Titian and Rembrandt and Velasquez. He didn't want people talking in terms of Soutine and certain other artists. So, for example, like Rothko and such.
Yeah, Rothko, who he has a go at in one of the videos, and Soutine, a young Jewish artist living in France, who died quite young, I believe in 1943. Soutine, but
he died because of delays in medical treatment, because he was it was just quite complicated anyway. Yeah, he was in hiding basically. Yeah.
But of course, this is not this is also a great tradition, and you can look. I mean, Rembrandt did paintings besides beef. I can't remember if it's a painter, if it's a drawing or an etching, but certainly Velasquez did paintings of this subject. There are Dutch paintings from the early 17th century, and even some pictures in the later 16th century of carcasses and things. So this subject has been of interest other artists as well.
This is reminding me of the Scott Walker album Tilt, D, because famously Scott Walker went to an abattoir.
Oh yeah,
and made the noise by literally smacking the side of a carcass.
Smacking a carcass, yeah.
That was a horrifying album, but this would be a very good image to look at while you're listening to it.
I think the next picture is also another one of these Soutine, and you can certainly see, you could certainly see the sort of connection, I think, to Bacon.
So is the idea, Dee, that all of these influences that we're seeing, we will see when we finally get to the work of Bacon? We're going to see elements of these, in the next.
Well, we finally get to
in the next stream when we get to Bacon.
No. We've got time. We're going to get there. We're going to get there today.
Yeah, so Bacon specifically said he was excited by the brushwork, the free brushwork, and the colour These aspects tend to go away in the later Bacon, which may also be another reason why he stopped talking about Soutine, is that he stopped painting in that sort of style. So I should sort of correct myself. It wasn't entirely him being sort of jealous and being covering his tracks, as it were. He did actually change his taste later on in his life. Oh, so here we have a Van Gogh self-portrait. So this would be from the Paris period, I guess.
Yeah.
88.
87.
87, 88. So yeah, so Bacon was a huge admirer of Van Gogh. He held up Van Gogh as a model for, especially for his letters and for his example. Bacon became quite involved in portraiture in the late 50s and the early 60s, and so this was when he was closest to Van Gogh. And he did actually later on a series of paintings based on a Van Gogh painting. But so Van Gogh was exciting for him. He mentioned him in letters, and he also talked about wanting to paint truth, but by using lies. So using exaggeration, by using heightened color, by using heightened brushwork, by simplifying and abstracting and removing something from reality in order to explain something about, as you said, the truth of the human condition.
And I think Bacon was. I think that Van Gogh was also quite. There's a big change in Bacon's work when he does the series inspired by a particular painting of Van Gogh. So you'll see a huge change. So I think that he was certainly a great influence. And also, Van Gogh was also an extraordinary perceptive and intuitive painter and portraitist. I think Bacon was also really impressed by a lot of the portraits that he did of himself and others, because famously he did many portraits, including lots of portraits of just families who helped him out, and many of them were given as gifts. So,
Dio, does Van Gogh have Bowie eyes?
No, I mean I don't believe
in this painting it looks like it, but
it looks like it, but I don't believe he had that. I can't remember what that condition, heterochromativity, I believe, something like that.
Wasn't the story was that actually one of the irises became one of the pupils became more dilated after he was punched, and so that tended to obscure the true color rather than actually changing the color. That's what I heard.
It may be, yes, but Bowie, Bowie has famously had a frozen pupil because he was punched when he was young
with a compass. I heard. Ooh. Sounds very painful.
Bacon also, weirdly enough, had some sort of eye injury. I didn't include that there's a painting which is really come to light and more recent. Well, it's been sort of rediscovered. Not that it was not seen at the time it was painted, but Bacon had some sort of eye injury, which and there are different explanations for the source of it. And this Bacon had a reproduction of this drawing in his amongst the studio material, and that he did a portrait. Bacon did a portrait inspired by this particular drawing, which was a study for a painting. So, and again, there are many sort of Van Gogh inspired works in Bacon's catalogue. Okay.
So this is this portrait. This would be the portrait of the Japanese guy, wasn't it?
Yeah, I can't. Oh.
Yeah. So anyway, while the
Isaku Yanihara is the sitter in this.
yeah, so this is a painting by Alberto Giacometti. Giacometti is a really interesting artist who started out in the 1920s, influenced by Surrealism, and he was very close to the Surrealists, and then he renounced Surrealism, and then during the war he was stuck in Switzerland. I mean, he was Swiss anyway, but he lived in Paris. He was in Switzerland, and he basically went back to observing figures and drawing. So he was drawing figures and portraits from life, so rather than from imagination, because when he was a surrealist he was using imagination. This is one of his typical post-war paintings, which includes lots of adjustments, lots of lines. Artists sometimes use lines as sort of measuring devices when they're trying to get the proportions correct. This can become something of a tic or a trait, so it becomes detached from pure measurement. Anyway, so this is something that Alberto Giacometti did quite a lot, and you'll notice that there's a sort of a painted frame around the edge of the picture, and this was something that Giacometti did a lot, not only in paintings and drawings, but also in his sculpture.
Yes, and Bacon and Giacometti knew each other. You know, they were actual contemporaries, and I don't know that they would have been friends, but they certainly knew each other. They
knew each other a little bit socially. Giacometti came to visit Bacon. There was the Giacometti show at the Tate in London in, I think it was 1965. I think it was the year before Giacometti died. They did know each other a little bit before that. They also knew each other through an artist come model called Isabel Rawsthorne, who was painted and drawn and sculpted by Giacometti quite a lot before the war, and by Bacon after the war. Remember also that that Bacon was going to Paris quite a bit, even in the 1940s and 1950s. So he had a chance to meet artists like Giacometti. They weren't particularly close, but they were on friendly terms. There are photographs of Bacon assisting Giacometti setting up his exhibition in 1965 in London. At this time also, Giacometti said, I want to paint George Dyer, who is a character involved with Francis Bacon, who we'll talk about later, probably in another stream. And he said he wanted to paint George Dyer. George Dyer had also been painted by Bacon, and there was this idea of getting George Dyer to go over to Paris, but it was all too complicated, and for various reasons it fell through, so it never happened. And Giacometti died in 66 or something anyway, so there wasn't enough time to get that organised.
So the next slide is a sculpture by Giacometti, and I just included this because it just really, I see a lot of Francis. This is from 1965, so after Bacon was very well known, in a very late work by Giacometti. But I see a lot of things that we will see in Bacon's work in this particular sculpture, the cubicle and the relationship of the figure within the cubicle, and that is a hell of a nose check. This
It's a hell of a long nose.
This piece is, I believe, called The Nose, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, The Nose. Yeah.
Oh, so these sort of cuboid sort of frame devices, there were things that Giacometti had been using since his surrealist period, so sort of early 1930s. But he also used them in his later sort of more figurative period as well. So Bacon would have been very well aware of these by the 1940s anyway.
This is just again another piece of detritus from Bacon's studio. This is a book about radiography, positioning and radiography. But you can see that Bacon drew from all sorts of sources, whether they be sort of news photographs, medical textbooks, fine art. Again, another sort of correlation you can make with Warhol. We can recall certainly a mark of a 20th century artist to sort of have to deal with the media, the mass media, as well as sort of more refined influences that we've been discussing previously.
Bacon was an avid reader of medical science books and journals, and he was always quizzing his doctor, who he saw very often and had a close relationship with, and also gave him a good picture as well. He used to quiz his doctor about all sorts of various medical techniques. There are unconfirmed reports that Bacon himself had cosmetic surgery, as well as other sort of necessary medical surgery. Okay, so this is Graham Sutherland. So you remember we talked about the neo-romantics, nothing to do with Duran Duran or Human League. This was the neo-romantics of the 1930s and 40s. So this is Graham Sutherland painting from 1947. This is Crucifixion. Graham Sutherland, very prominent artist in the 1930s and 40s, early 40s. He was considered the gold standard of British advanced painting. This was a lot more powerful, a lot more punchy, and a lot more sort of gore and grip than the paintings of the Bloomsbury set and abstract artists like William Nicholson. So Sutherland became a very favoured painter. He had lots of supporters, including Kenneth Clark, who was the youngest ever director of the National Gallery at the time when this painting was made. That also entailed that Sutherland became a war artist. So he was not called up for service, but he was able to visit various places around the country and make art for the War Department, as it was then, which has later gone on to be acquired by the Imperial War Museum. And Sutherland's very interesting artist, is deeply involved in religion. He became a Catholic convert when he married his wife. Spent a lot of time thinking about Christian themes and so forth. Deeply involved with looking at nature. So you see those sort of thorn-like forms at the bottom. He was always looking at natural forms and trying to combine these with human forms and animal forms. Sutherland and Bacon were close basically in the first half of the 1940s. And Sutherland introduced Bacon to all sorts of useful people, patrons, sponsors, critics, and so forth. He introduced him to gallerists. So Bacon and Sutherland were working sort of hand in hand. They were exchanging ideas during the 1940s. Later on, of course, guess what? They fall out. Bacon kind of disowns him. Sutherland gets a little bit frosty. So, it was ever thus, especially with Bacon. But this is a really key influence if you want to understand how Bacon was in the 1940s.
Just so interest, the making art for the War Department, what did that entail? Was that just propaganda posters and things? Or?
No, absolutely not. It was actually to do with documenting stuff. So it was mainly to do with documenting the national industry, so shipbuilding, coal mining, so to a degree farming and so forth, especially heavy industry. It was also to do with documenting, soldiers, the military service. So this would be either in active duty or sort of, training or sort of in their downtime. You'd also have depictions of bomb sites. So Sutherland in particular spent a lot of time, and also John Piper, visited bomb sites. So places that have been destroyed, domestic places, and these pictures were all gathered. Theoretically, everything belonged to the War Department, but these artists were kind of like selling stuff on the side. But most of the production that they made was given to the War Department, in return for, I think it was a sort of a serviceman's salary. So they weren't getting paid a lot for this, but they were getting paid to document stuff in an artistic fashion.
And Sutherland actually did a lot of work in Wales. A lot of this documentation of bomb damage, both in countryside and in cities in Wales, as well as in London. But he's particularly associated with Wales. In fact, I believe he returned there after the war at some point.
And he was also documenting the steel mills in South Wales as well. Yeah.
And Sutherland is also known as being involved in the rebuilding or the construction of the replacement for the old Coventry Cathedral. And indeed, there's an enormous altarpiece there.
The giant tapestry. Apparently, that was commissioned by Sir Basil Spence, as he became Sir Basil. And he commissioned Sutherland to do this giant crucifixion, which is absolutely massive tapestry that's just a phenomenal technical achievement. It has to be supported in all sorts of different ways to stop it ripping, because it's it's I think sort of incredible. It's like 10 meters tall or something ridiculous. And it was sort of inaugurated in the 1950s after a long period of the new cathedral being built and then all the new art being commissioned for it. And supposedly, strictly off the record, Spence said that he wished he'd commissioned Bacon instead of Sutherland.
I like the way you said technical achievement, because that's certainly how I would see it. I really hate these. Although I don't like the entire reconstruction of Coventry. I don't like it. So there we go.
Yeah. So is this another Sutherland?
Yeah, another Sutherland. A less well-known one from 1947. I believe this is a deposition from the cross. And I put this sort of at the end because I think that I believe that I can't remember the particular association around the time of Bacon's first sort of quote official artistic work, which we'll see in a moment, but there was some association with Sutherland and Bacon.
They were
in an exhibition together?
Yeah, they exhibited together in 1944, and that was due to Sutherland inviting Bacon in because some artists dropped out, and so Sutherland said, "Well, there's this chap called Bacon. He had something reproduced in the Herbert Reed book in 1933. It hasn't done much since, but he's doing some exciting stuff. Bring him in." And I think that was the 1944 exhibition. Well, no, it was the 1945 exhibition, wasn't it? When he exhibited the three studies. So and they were really close together. And Bacon was asking, they were going backwards and forwards because Sutherland was in Menton, which is right next to Monaco, which was where Bacon was, because Bacon at the end of the war was in Monaco. Interesting questions as to how he's getting back and forth between Monaco
exactly
and London during a war, but he managed it somehow. Anyway, so they were very close and they were helping each other out. They were writing to each other all the time. They were going to social events, and also Bacon and Sutherland were exchanging ideas and even sort of transporting each other's work around. They were going to each other's studios, so they were very closely linked.
Okay, so I should have had a sort of transitional slide here. So that's sort of the influences. I know there was a very long section, but I think it's very interesting to sort of take a detailed look at sort of how influence works in the career of an artist, especially a well-known artist.
We should probably change the name of the stream, D, to the life and influences of Francis Bacon, and have the next one on the art or something like that. What do you reckon?
So I popped in these two slides just before we actually start to talk about Bacon's sort of mature work, because I think there's a couple of things that people will notice with his art. For one, this is the verso of Self-Portrait from 1969. In fact, it is the self-portrait that I tweeted out yesterday as a sort of advertisement for the stream. And this was given by Bacon as a gift. But I've included this because almost without exception, all of Bacon's paintings are painted on the back of the canvas. So when you have artist canvas, in the case of Francis Bacon, it was linen is the base fabric, which is the historically most common and best support for if you're going to use a fabric support. Cotton is also used for sort of cheaper canvases as well. But when you generally don't, it's not the most sound practice to paint on raw linen. So of course what is done is the linen is sized in which basically a layer of weak glue is put on it, which help protect the fabric, because of course the oil paint will have deleterious acidic effects if you just paint it straight on the fabric. So a glue is added, and then of course the canvas is primed, and so this is generally a sort of white layer of lead priming or other sorts of white priming, and so most artists begin their paintings on a fairly stark white primed canvas. So, but in Bacon's case, he preferred the abrasive texture of the raw linen fiber itself, and so he would purchase primed canvas and then just attach it to the stretcher frame backwards. So you can see that the white priming was the reverse of the painting, and Bacon painted on the raw side.
Sorry.
No.
So the story that Bacon had for why he started was that he said he was in Monte Carlo, so that's Monaco, and he'd lost all his money from gambling, of course, because that's what he was doing there at the time. I think we'll get onto that. And so he hadn't got any money, and he wanted to do a painting, and he'd used up all his paintings. He couldn't afford any more material, so he just turned around a canvas and started painting on the back. And he liked the way that the raw canvas, the tooth, as it were, held the paint. And this became his preferred method of painting. So it's simply because he ran out of surfaces to work on. What happened later on was he would go to his colourman, which is the old-fashioned term for an art material seller, and he would get these canvases made to specific sizes. So as we'll see, his standard size, he had two standard size, one of them, which is this one, which was 14 by 10 inches. Yeah. And the other one, which was, I can't remember the inches now, but it's 198 centimeters by 147 centimeters wide. And he just basically worked in those two sizes. And and he would get his colourman to make them to specific sizes. The larger size, quite amusingly, he chose simply because it was the largest size that would fit into his studio from 1961 onwards.
The door of the studio, yeah. And by the way, it's 78 1/8 inch by 58 1/4 about, and almost all of his pictures, the larger ones, that's the size. So he did work on basically two standard sizes for most of his career.
Because he the studio upstairs where he spent most of his time, it was quite steep, and he would basically get the largest painting that would fit up the stairs. So you'll think about aesthetics and what's his rationale for this and what's his justification. No, it's just the biggest thing he could get through the door and sort of manhandle up. Yeah. Now, Mr. D, can you guess who V is?
Yes. I happen to know who V is.
Go on then.
Except, of course, I've just now that you've thrown down, I've forgotten. Hang on.
Well, I've cheated. I've got
You
the
tell
catalogue
me.
resonate. I've got the catalogue resonate.
Oh, you've got the yes, which mine is
Open-
not. Yeah.
Open to page 920, and this is halfway through his career. Open to page 920, and it says this is Valerie Beston.
Oh, Valerie Beston. Yes, that's it.
So this is Valerie from the gallery. This is
Yeah.
the name of the manager of the London branch of the Marlborough Gallery, which was his commercial dealer, and Valerie was his sorter, and she played an important role in his life, which we'll discuss as in the coming stream or streams. And this was a gift from Bacon to Valerie.
Indeed. Yes. And yeah, very, very quickly, I've got to look. This was. I'll have to pull this up later on. I was going to look at how it was recently auctioned. Actually, there's a slide at the very last slide in the deck. We can talk when we finish and talk about Bacon's market. We'll get to it. If you want to go to the next picture, the other thing that people should know about Bacon's artwork is that almost without exception, they are all framed in various gold frames, various gilt frames. There are several styles of frames. Bacon used the same framer for years and years and years. And again, depending upon the size of the picture, he would use one type of molding or the other. So almost all Francis Bacon pictures are in gilt frames, and they are all, as far as I know, displayed behind glass. So you will not be able to see a Francis Bacon in a museum without looking at one that's behind a layer of glass. And I find it incredibly annoying. I will say it's one of the most frustrating aspects of looking at Bacon's work for me. Now, of course, there have been people who have said that his choice to put all of his pictures behind glass, and this is specified. In fact, it's actually written on the back of many of his works, or at least quite a number of his works, that it must be displayed behind glass. There are people who have suggested that this was some sort of distancing, technique. It was meant to sort of make you, because you can't look at them without seeing the reflection of everything else in the room and without seeing your own reflection. And of course, some people have suggested that this was the reason that he did it. Now, again, with Bacon, we don't really know. Bacon denied this, and he said it would be absolutely stupid for him to have done that, for people to see the reflection. It's just that he said that, early on there was no non-reflective glass available. That was only a later innovation. Although he never used it, even though it was available later on in his career, he still used totally reflective glass. But I think this is certainly something that people should note. I mean, all the reproductions I have, of course, I don't include the frame, and many of those reproductions were photographed with the painting taken out of the glass. But be aware, if you ever go to see them in person, they will be behind glass. Do you have any feelings about this?
Yeah. So there's the two thoughts. One is that that the reflections they're intended to be part of the art. I agree that probably isn't the main intention. I think there are possibly two other reasons. One is that it's a unifying effect, because when you look at Bacon's paintings, you've got a mixture of impasto, which is thick, paste-like painting. You also have areas of flat color, which have sort of sunk in and they're quite dull. And then you've got areas of like sort of stippling, and then you've got the raw canvas. So when you've got the glass over it, it tends to unify things and to reduce the varied reflectivity of the surfaces of the actual paintings.
And artists in the past would have varnished their pictures. I mean, the standard practice for traditional oil painting is for the painting to be placed under a layer of resin varnish, which will have the effect that Mr. Adams is talking about, kind of unifying the surface. Which is why if you look at older oil pictures, they're almost always shiny, because that's the varnish, bringing it all together. But now, of course, if you've got raw canvas, you can't really varnish it in the traditional
No,
way.
you can't, because the varnish will sink into it, and it will change. It'll make the canvas permanently darker. It will changes the optical effect. And I would say that there's that, and then there is the third potential reason, which is to do with status. It's valuable paintings, famous paintings. They're the ones behind glass. That's why you don't see a Leonardo that isn't behind glass, for example. So
and the gold,
it may be a bit
frame
of a,
as well.
Yeah, so it may, and the gold frame. So it may be a bit of a flex on his part. The only time I've seen a Bacon painting that's not behind glass was there's the triptych in the Guggenheim, and they butchered it because they put them all in the one frame. They put the three paintings in the one frame, and it's not behind glass, and it looks like
it's awful.
It doesn't look very good.
No, absolutely awful. I mean, and almost all of the other triptych paintings. A triptych is a painting just in 3 parts like this. They're usually displayed as you see them, as you see this particular one here. That 3 separate works with quite a bit of space in between them. They're not, just for sort of technical reasons. For some of the slides, I've sort of had to push them close together, but they're all the smaller ones are framed in a slightly different way, but the same general idea. All right, here we go.
So here is the first 2.5 hours in. We come to the first serious painting that Bacon acknowledged. This is the 1944. Well, there's debate about the dates, but it's probably 1944, potentially also 1945 painting of 3 studies for the base of a crucifixion. This is in the Tate Gallery. This has also appeared in Deepest Law before, I believe, when I was talking about Bacon.
There's a thumbnail with this picture.
So this is basically the painting that he exhibited in April 1945, which shocked people and sent him to relative stardom, or at least respectability or notoriety, when it was reviewed in 1944. This was the first work that he acknowledged as being mature work. So during his lifetime, all of the catalogues start with this picture. There is nothing earlier than this, even though there are some earlier pictures than this that exist.
And it's all come together. There's Picasso's girlfriend. There's the mother. Remember the scream with the mother? You can see it. You can see all the elements now. In the past hour and a half, we're looking at influences.
That's it.
Now
We've done it. We've unified it.
the frame. I can't remember the name of the artist now, but the one with the frame.
Giacometti.
Giacometti.
The bit of blades of the bit of turf, which sort of get Van Gogh there.
Got a bit of furniture. Got modernist furniture on the left. They are everything.
Oh, there it is. But I would say that this picture, I mean, for various reasons, is quite. It's quite a jolt, I mean, first of all, I mean, you get the interplay between the title, and what you're looking at. I mean, 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion, Now, of course, again, we know that there's a long tradition of depicting the Christ's crucifixion in Western art. And of course, also with the figures at the base of the cross. I mean, who would it have been? So, and then of course it invites you to say, well, what am I looking at in comparison to that title, to that proposition? And also Bacon has positioned himself, in the role of, he's adopted the triptych, the 3-panel form, which was very commonly used to produce altarpieces. In fact, there are many small folding altarpieces. These would be images for private devotion, where you would have predella, you would have wings, the 2 flanking panels, and then the central panel, and often they were hinged. And so Bacon, of course, is using these devices, using these very well-known devices of Western art, and particularly religious art, and then presenting us with these beasts, these creatures, what is the line from Yeats?
Terrible beauty is born.
Slouching towards Bethlehem, waiting to be born. Yes, and so I don't know if you want to expound upon these questions, Mr. Adams, or not.
Well, he was later interviewed at length, so Bacon was quite. He was both quite open, but also relatively guarded about what he said about interpreting. He never directly interpreted his paintings, which I found was very wise.
Yes,
it's
always wise from artists.
Yeah, so he talked about the circumstances of production and some references, but he wouldn't actually explain the pictures themselves, which is the way I always act when I'm talking about my own work.
Oh, indeed. I never, ever, certainly never in my professional career, ever talk about meaning. And I think it's quite common for artists. I mean, also, I think in the case of any honest artist, I mean, ultimately, at the center of that creation is mystery. And I think that Bacon, honestly, like many artists, really know a great work of art. It can't really be sort of summarized. It's not the end product of a kind of rational process, and certainly not in the case of the example of Francis Bacon. So I think that honestly, he didn't know. I don't know where things come from ultimately, and yes, I mean, of course, he can discuss influences, he can discuss circumstances, but. And also I don't like to speculate upon meaning either. I prefer, we pose questions rather than try to provide answers, because I don't think there are answers. The answer is what you're seeing. The answer is this painting.
Yeah, and also these works were generated by a whole series of different associations. It's not like Bacon had a set plan. So Bacon was quite well known for not drawing his images in advance and doing painted versions. So there's a whole debate about whether or not he drew at all. Now, there are a couple of drawings from the 1930s and stuff, but they're sort of mixed technique and stuff, and they're not really proper drawings, and they're a bit of a mishmash. Later on, he didn't really do drawings on paper and then transfer them to paintings. So what he was doing was he was making these paintings, making these forms as he was painting them. And in some cases, you can see that there have been changes, there have been revisions, there have been accidents which have mounted up on top of other accidents. So Bacon himself wasn't actually probably clear about what the picture was going to be when it was finished. So there's an influence of all these different artists. There's a difference of biomorphism. There's the photography. People have talked about, the death camps, the photographs of the death camps that were being revealed at the time, and war imagery. And we should explain also that Bacon was he was a warden, fire warden, briefly during the war. So he was actually retrieving bodies. He was seeing scraps of cloth or curtains sort of being scraped with blood and dust and so forth. So he was seeing all of this stuff around him. Later in the war, he went to the home counties. He was staying with one of his lovers, and partly because he was pretty useless as a war warden because he had asthma, so you couldn't get him near a bomb site because the dust would choke him. He couldn't really do anything, so he wasn't much use in that sense. So that's why he left the city, and this was where he painted these scenes. But these were based on images and memories, not only of art, but of personal experiences that he'd seen himself. Later on, he talked about these in terms of Eumenides, the Furies. So these were the Greek monsters that were supposed to embody the conscience, and these would haunt the guilty person. And this was something also that T.S. Eliot wrote about a lot, and he may have got the idea from Eliot, indirectly from reading, not in person.
And also Bacon profoundly influenced, certainly in his own words, by Aeschylus, by Eurystheia. Aeschylus, which we'll get onto because there's a specific triptych that is explicitly inspired by that work. But this is of course, the three-part story about various happenings in a family and the consequences of awakening the Fury's wrath. So yes, and thanks for bringing that up because he did refer to these as Furies later on. If you want to go whilst we're still talking about this, I've got details of this painting the next few slides. So
before I flick this on, I have to ask, if you had to be trapped in a room with one of these three, which one would you go for? All right,
I would go for the first one because it's less immediately harmful. Maybe
yes,
I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's got no mouth, so I think it's there's less chance of it talking to you or biting you.
Yes. The other thing that of course strikes me about this picture is the shocking orange color. Now, of course, for ages I've wanted to do a stream about the influence of artists' pigment and the sort of innovations of pigment as in a way one of the things that shape the kind of history of the type of painting that artists were able to do. I mean, of course, this orange color would have been impossible in prior to certainly the 19th century to have that kind of color in a picture in any major way because there just weren't any fairly stable pigments. You could certainly get you could get a red, but you couldn't really get an orange like that. And also, of course, I think at one point Bacon said that he liked this color because it was impossible to sort of integrate tastefully into an interior. Now, of course, that changed later on with different when tastes changed and decorating styles. But if you imagine the period when this picture was made, 1944, and the world that of course Bacon was born into and came up in, this painting would be a shocking object, not only because of the figures, but just because of the kind of rude, brash radiance of that particular orange. And you'll see this color or variations of this color in Bacon's work right up till his last pictures.
And also, this was a color that Sutherland also strongly favored at the time.
Well, must have been shocking in 1944. The world was black and white back then. That's why.
Yeah, Bacon literally invented color.
Next slide. Well, let's look at the details. Also, near the end of Bacon's career, he revisits this picture famously. So, and this is in the collection of the Tate. I assume it's still hanging, although they rehung the Tate, so there may be a work by a more important black lesbian artist that placed it. But
all you have to do is to change the spelling to Frances with an E, and he becomes female.
Well, he's an LGBT icon, so he should be there.
Oh, yes.
Next.
Trump hair, someone is saying in the the dregs of civilization.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
Bacon also looked at things like he was interested in photography, journalism, and also trick photography. And there was a series of photographs of spiritualists doing things with sort of drapes and bandages and stuff, and making sort of kooky shapes and so on. And it's possible that may have fed into this painting.
You could take it. You could take a typical kind of left-wing protest or something. Replace the face with that. I'm sure I've seen elements of the. You see, like you look at this horror there. You can kind of, we talk about the physiognomy of Antifa types and so on.
Oh, it's the Midwest female lecturer with the eyes and the glasses. Yeah. That's
yeah.
sort of mouth. Yeah.
Oh dear.
No, I'm bringing down the tone. Sorry.
It's okay. It had to happen sooner or later.
This has often been reproduced next to photographs of Goebbels speaking.
You want to go to the next slide?
Oh, there you go. Sorry, I crashed your punch.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I've done this for a few of the pictures. Is included a possible sort of reference. Much has been made of this. I mean, this picture, as we saw earlier, there was a reproduction of this picture in Bacon's studio and on his wall. So he certainly was aware of this. Now, of course, recently, I believe I should have checked the date, but I've seen some articles trying to sort of ignite controversy, saying that Bacon that these works are actually Nazi inspired and they're crypto-Nazi, because of course he. No mention, of course, of all the other hundreds and thousands of images of various sorts that made their way into his pictures. But
well, I wouldn't exactly say depicting Goebbels as this is glorified.
No, I don't understand. But I did see something talking about the uncovering the controversial, inspirations.
Except this has been documented by. Well, as been documented since 1950, and also
for ages.
You've had whole books published on the subject in recent years. Yeah.
Very odd, but.
Oh, and there's also a painting with it which includes a swastika and.
Yes, there's literally a Nazi armband. In it, there's a couple of paintings actually. There's one that I'd never seen before. One of the earlier kind of black portraits, which has a sort of muddled armband, but, and a later picture as well. Okay.
Yeah. So this is a painting from 1945, I believe.
Yep.
45, so I think.
Yeah.
1946. Yeah. So this I think this was recently exhibited at the Royal Academy show. If anyone saw the Royal Academy show last year, it was terrific. And the opening room was completely black, and there was just these few highlighted paintings with this sort of fierce, fiery orange. And this is it's quite a shocker. Yeah. He was working with lots of images of animals, of dictators. He was actually painting figures in sort of, there was this one of someone riding in a Mercedes that was taken from a photograph from Picture Post, which was an illustrated periodical at the time, and so he was. Combining those images with those of animals, those of interiors, and so forth. And a lot of the paintings from this first mature period are quite experimental, and they're particularly exciting because you can see that Bacon himself wasn't quite sure how things were going to turn out. Pictures would go through multiple stages. They would get photographed as finished, and then he would go over them. He would completely paint out whole areas, even though everyone had assumed that the picture was finished. And he was also destroying a lot at this time. So this is why the paintings from the 1940s are so exciting, because they are really on the edge. Because he was a gambler. Should have mentioned that when he was in Monte Carlo, he was doing a great deal of gambling. He made his living from gambling, not from painting. He was getting no money from art in the 1940s until about 1945, until just when the war was ending. He got all his money from gambling. He was running illegal gambling dens, as it were, just small scale, but he was also gambling legally, as it were, in Monte Carlo, which is where the high society would go to gamble. They would go to the casino in Monte Carlo. And Bacon was based in Monaco in 1945. So I guess this is between the period of the liberation of Paris and the end of the war. It's a little bit unclear about what the exact dates involved, But yeah, so he was a natural gambler. He was a risk taker, and these paintings from the 1940s are really exciting because he is taking genuine risks. He ruined a whole bunch of pictures that were really quite good because he took them too far.
Yeah, and of course, when you work the way he did, again, without any sort of preconceived notion or sketch directly on the canvas, especially when you're working on the unprimed side of canvas, you can easily just ruin it. I mean, that's, I think, why there was, he had there was a great ratio of success to failure, because you could just easily lose it, and sometimes there's no way of coming back. So it's always as Mr. Adams said, a gambler, and he was, and again, a lifelong gambler, both literally and figuratively. The other thing that interests me about this picture is the appearance of the umbrella, and you will see umbrellas in many Bacon paintings throughout the years. I've always found this sort of fascinating because, of course, the etymology of the word umbrella, I mean, it comes from a sort of Italian/Latin, ultimately from umbra, which means shadow. And so, of course, the association between the umbrella as putting the figure in shadow, and of course the idea of the self and its shadow. I mean, these sort of Jungian concepts, I think, come up a lot, and Bacon was fascinated with the idea of the human being and its shadow, and you will see that done figuratively and literally many times in his work. But it's very interesting, of course, that the figure's shadow manifests itself from a literal rolled umbrella, a British rolled umbrella, which of course is casting the shadow on this beast of suffering, this creature, and again, another theme, certainly from Northern religious art, this idea of sort of religious and metaphysical suffering. Seems it's something that was strongly interested Bacon.
Bad luck, of course, as well. Umbrella open indoors is a bad luck. So.
Okay. We're going to see if we can get out of the 1940s before we have to.
I doubt that. I'm going to have to go. I have to go in a couple of minutes. Yeah. So.
Okay.
Yes, maybe have to be the last one.
Okay, so this is Figure in a Landscape from 1945. This painting is from the Tate collection. Went to the Tate fairly early. It was bought by, I think, the subject. The subject is it's Eric. Is it Eric Hall?
Yeah, I believe so. Friend of Bacon, who was, I believe it was based upon a photograph of him sitting in the park.
Yeah, so Eric Hall was a friend and a supposed lover of Bacon, who was an official in the city of London, and they would travel, and they traveled to the south of France when they were able to. I mean, they were living in London together, but then they were also traveling to the south of France when that was possible. Because also Sutherland traveled to the south of France as soon as he could, because a lot of people wanted to go to these places that they hadn't been able to since 1939. And so this is a painting of his lover asleep on a park bench. Interesting use of material. Do you want to mention that material, Mr. D?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of dust on this picture, if that's what you're referring to.
Yeah.
And this was again something that will come in with so many of Bacon's other work. In fact, I've got one of the video clips. He's literally talking about it, and he mentions this picture. He said he was talking about, this was something from like 1987. He talks about recently going to Tate and saying that all the dust is still there, clinging to the surface, but he would routinely sweep just dust from the floor and objects in his studio and throw it onto the canvas. He would also a lot of times mix sand with his paint as well. So yes, this picture is, if you look at it closely, is quite filthy, and it deliberately so.
And I have the listing here in the catalogue raisonné. It says oil, pastel, and dust on canvas.
I know. I've got so many in my collection here. Yeah, where dust is literally listed as a material. So yes, the dust comes into play again and again. It's funny in the little video clip. He talks about that because he used a lot of pastels. He talks about being annoyed because the dust starts getting too many colors in it because of all the pastel dust around. So he liked the dust, the color of a good gray tweed jacket, he said. So.
Well, maybe next time, which is going to be in 2 weeks, we can start off with some of the videos. Now we've got to know Bacon and his influences and some of his works here. Maybe we can start off the next stream with some of those videos. D, does that sound like a good idea?
Yeah, that sounds good.
So I unfortunately I'm gonna have to. I've got a pretty hard finish here because I have to go and pick up my daughter. I cannot be late for it. But there are a couple of super chats here. Jeremy Beadle, 8 Henry's Cat, says, I have been looking forward to the stream with anticipation. I've been a fan of Bacon since I was a child, and I do recall my great aunt for having a lithograph of a triptych, though I was rather young. And then in the super chats, it's Fishy Frenzy says 55 pence each for the Marvell, Bowie and Warhol streams. Well, thank you very much for them. And Jura says, excellent as always. I look forward to more. Thanks to Mr. D and Mr. Adams. And I echo those sentiments. Been a fantastic stream, gentlemen. But I think we're going to have to reconvene in a couple of weeks to get to I think the meat of his career and his work. So just before we get out of here, anything you'd like to promote just once again before we leave? Mr. Adams.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to Mr. D for putting the hard work with the images and the videos. If you want to follow me on Twitter, Adams Artist, then that would be much appreciated. Also, any paid subscriptions to alexanderadamsart.substack.com would be greatly appreciated. And the Twitter pinned tweet is on how to acquire 2 prints by me. That would help me out.
Cringe Walker with a very late super chat saying, would love one on John Hartfield one day. D, any kind of closing comments?
No, I just thank you first and foremost to Alexander Adams for suggesting the stream and talking so eloquently about Bacon and as he suggested, he's written quite a number of articles and reviews of Bacon. So definitely check out his Substack and his blog and everything. If people are curious, you can follow me on Twitter. Probably be a link in the description. And thank you for hosting, AA.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, guys. Do pick up a course at the academic agency, join the channel, subscribe to my Substack, but most importantly of all, ladies and gentlemen, get out.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.